So welcome to Oceanside Chat. I'm Helen Wang, the host and editor of the program. I want to thank our students, faculty, and industry professionals who attend today's live event. Supply chain management has over 100 years of history that started with labor-intensive process and eventually evolved to engineering and managing extraordinary complex global networks. From 1940 to 1990, logistic management was front and center, advanced by operation research to improve transportation efficiency. However, since mid-1990s, globalization movement and manufacturing growth trended away from logistic function to operational centric and strategy-driven challenges. As summarized by McKinsey, over the last 30 years, logistics has undergone a tremendous change from a purely operational function that reported to sales or manufacturing to an independent supply chain management function that in some companies is already being led by the chief supply chain officer. The focus of supply chain management function has shifted to advance the planning process, while logistics has often been outsourced to third-party providers. The supply chain function ensures integrated operations from customers to suppliers. Furthermore, supply chain executives are now leading great organizations. For example, Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, and Mary T. Barra, the CEO of General Motors, are both supply chain veterans. In this episode, I'm pleased to introduce Tom Linton, who is a visionary leader and award-winning supply chain officer, a senior advisor at McKinsey, also a long-term board member for our Institute for Supply Chain Excellence and Innovation at UC San Diego. Tom, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Helen. Glad to be here.
So you have won so many awards. As a matter of fact, you are one of the chief supply chain officers that I know win most of the awards. Let me just name a few of them. So the Institute of Supply Management's Shipman Gold Medal, and Garner's Supply Chain Innovator Award, the Procurement Leaders Award on Global Risk Management, as well as Chief Procurement Officer Hall of Fame. And there's more. But seriously, Tom, what do your family and friends think you do all day?
They have no idea. We know it's supply chain, but what's interesting is, except for a lot of the folks that are in this this webinar, very few people really understand what that means, right? You know, the word supply chain have just become almost become synonymous with problem in the last couple of years. So people just go, oh, when you say supply chain, I'm sure you all experience it, right? They all go, oh. Because it's just in the news. I mean, I was reading just this week that it's the #1 most used word in earnings calls this quarter. Supply chain is just, you know, usually it might be inventory or who knows, right? Sales, but supply chain is actually, they keep track of these things apparently. So it's pretty well known at this point.
Yeah, I'm curious, you know, besides this that you do for profession, what would your talent be if you were Mr. World?
Oh, I don't know. You know, I kind of, like most people, I kind of fell into supply chain and procurement just because where I was early in my career. You know, you go back in the 70s and early 80s, right? You just got assigned to a function and that's where you get started. So I've always probably been more creative than practical. And supply chain is more of an operations thing. So if anything, probably, you know, I like dabbling in art and things like that. So I'm probably a little bit more on the creative side than maybe other supply chain people tend to be in operations. So that kind of comes out in the way I think about things.
Very interesting. Yeah. And I think people get to know your creative side more and more throughout the episode. You know, we're looking forward to that. Who are the most influential people in your life?
Well, I mean, my father was for sure. I mean, I remember when I was looking at career options coming out of university, and I had opportunities with like IBM and GE, and IBM actually had two different interviews for me. One was in sales, and one was in something called contracting purchasing. And I went to my dad and I said, you know, what do you think? I don't, you know, I was 22 years old in college. I had no idea what that meant. And he was in GE at the time. And he said, you know, he said, I don't think you're a sales guy. He said, I think you're more of a materials guy. So, I mean, just my dad's, you know, message there, you know, had me swing towards, you know, materials, and what at that time it was called materials and purchasing. I think transportation, purchasing materials was kind of the area I ended up in. But it was so very influential, right? That one comment had on my life. But I also, I mean, I'm kind of influenced, I think, a lot by, you know, just the overall macro view of you know, what's happening in the world. I think I'm not so much as political as I am economically political. I mean, you know, I remember reading Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations back very early in my college days, and the invisible hand of the economy, and how that influences, you know, really the world we live in today, supply, demand, and things like that, and you know, how business flows and moves. And I was just kind of always intrigued by, you know, books like that, which were more kind of economics. I really always thought about, I enjoyed economics, you know, both macro and microeconomics, and how that really fits into the world. So things I would say along those lines would be kind of where I was kind of always thinking. And more recently, in the first book I did with Rob Hanfield, The Living Supply Chain, we really took a more biological look at supply chain, or the corollaries or analogies to the environment. You know, how supply chains work. If you think of the ocean, for example, as an ecosystem, or how elk and aspen and predators in the West operate as an ecosystem. I mean, supply chains are like that, right? You have OEMs, you have suppliers, and they all feed into each other the same way that the natural world does. So we're kind of fascinated by how there are real parallels between the natural world and the physical world, really along those lines. And that's why in our second book, which is coming out next month, called Flow, we're really looking at more the physical side of the supply chain, not the more biological side of the supply chain, or at least those analogies. And so I think, you know, so I kind of look at things really broadly that way. And I kind of see things and how they flow and how they fit together and how they move. Kind of I don't want to use the word big picture, but kind of more of a macro view of the system of a supply chain, and how that, you know, works well together. And when the supply chain is functioning well, right, that system is working well. And I think that's kind of not just functionally or process or things like that, but more of that kind of view of the world.
Yeah, very interesting. And thanks for sharing your personal story. How did you start your career, you know, at the very beginning, by influenced by your father? And we actually, you know, in the university, right, our students are very curious, like what's the right career for them to start, you know, when they are still in college and have no idea, you know, what's out there. And I'm curious about, from career standpoint, a lot of people that I talk to, you know, in sort of the current generation of supply chain profession, as well as older generations, it feels like, you know, they almost started the supply chain career by accident. It's just sort of the fate led them that way. And I'm curious about, you know, with today's emphasis on supply chain, you know, would that change for the future generation who might be interested in this profession? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I agree with something you said up front. I think supply chain is rapidly going to be standing alone as really the glue that a corporation has to have. And so, you know, I mean, I've had this opportunity, but as a chief supply chain officer, you should be reporting to a CEO, chief procurement officer, similar. I think to dilute it and bury it actually sub-optimizes the financial outcomes that a company can experience, because, whether, a supply chain is really all about the balance sheet. It's about cash. It's about material in motion. And when it's not moving, it causes inventory. And so the flow of material through a company, or the motion associated with it, is essential. And so that's the balance sheet of a company. And then, the purchasing guy primarily, and these are primary versus secondary things. I think, you look at the purchasing function, it's more of a cost or income statement aligned function. And so, you look at balance sheet and income statement, and then you say, okay, revenue. But if you speed up your business and your supply chain is working effectively, you grow revenue, because in the same period of time, you can produce more days, right? So instead of, if you release 30 days of, if you reduce your inventory days and you compress it, you create more days to produce product, therefore you can increase your revenue. So there's this whole alignment between the financial outcomes that supply chain and procurement do to the engine of a company. We're like literally the circulation system of that company. And so the old mind of functional engines operating independently is really a bad one, because you really want to have a very integrated company, which is really governed by, the movement of material, which is a supply chain part. So it's almost like we used to think this way, and now we got to think, how things move through the company. Material comes in, they go through manufacturing, finished goods out the door, but that velocity is really what drives corporate success, I think, in this century. It really is about that efficiency. So you get underneath that another layer, and you start to say, well, why are my suppliers so far away? I need to get my suppliers closer to me. It facilitates the speed. And in one article I wrote, I said, speed. If you talk about supply chain, and this is really for some of the students, but speed is the theory of everything. In science, they always talk, what's the theory of everything? Well, in supply chain, speed is the theory of everything, because the faster things go, the better the financial outcomes or the achievement of the supply chain. So inventory turns, the customer satisfaction, revenue growth, cost reduction, cash, all those things are benefited by speed. So why have we designed supply chains that are stretched all over the earth when speed wins? Speed wins. So those are the kinds of things, I think, that matter.
So back to maybe, your achievements as well as your trajectory of your career, professional career. And I wanted to ask this question: what were the biggest risks that you took and later on become an award for you?
Well, at the time, this goes back to 1987, I was doing very well in IBM. For those of you who have IBM experience, at the time, I was like 25, 26-year-old, site purchasing manager at a second level position, very young in my career. And some executives were saying, I think you should have some international experience. And at the time, there was no PC. This is before the internet. This is like, basically it was all big mainframes that were governing IBM's future. And I remember thinking, I really should get some international experience. And everybody, a bunch of people said, you're going to kill your career. You don't want to do that. Don't go to Japan in 1987. Don't do it. You're going to kill your career. You need to go down and work in mainframes or something like that for your future. So I went to Japan. Well, history now tells us that was the right thing to do, right? Because at the time, no one was doing that. And so that was a very pivotal point in my life. Going to Japan, I spent the next 23 years in Asia. Rode both the PC boom, the internet boom, and obviously then became an executive, very senior executive at LG Corporation in Korea. And obviously had tremendous experience across the range of supply chain. So yeah, there are certain things I always tell people today. I said, you don't know what you should do, but be directionally correct. Don't rely on the advice of people who think the way things were. Think about what it's going to be like 10 years from now. If you were to plan your life your career 10 years from now, you should say, okay, if you're 30 years old, where do I want to be at 40 years old? And then plan backwards. Don't plan forwards. Don't say, what should I do next? Say, where do I want to be in 10 years? And then plot your course. But where do you want to be in 20 years? Then plot your course. And then what you do is you head that direction. And I always wanted to be a chief procurement officer very early in my career. I probably should have designed my career to be, okay, I should have been a chief executive officer, but I didn't plan it that way. So I didn't do the jobs you need to do in order to be a chief executive officer, but I did all the jobs I needed to do to be a chief procurement officer. So I think by planning your life and your career that way, you're going to be in much better shape than if you just kind of plod along and take jobs. Take the job, a recruiter called, I'm going to take this job. Yeah, but does it fit your plan? Do you have a plan? Where do you want to be? What are your goals? Things like that. My dad always said to me, he said, you have to follow your strong suit, know what you're good at, know what your competencies are. And if you don't, there's a lot of online things that'll help you, Myers-Briggs and others will help you understand what your competencies are. And then look at those very seriously and say, okay, how do I use those competencies in my goals in my career so that I can actually make sure that, you don't want to push a rope your whole life. You don't want to be doing something you shouldn't be doing. You won't be happy. So you might as well figure out what you're good at and then look at your goals far enough in advance to say, okay, now how do I use my strengths to get there?
Yeah, that's a great story that, sort of plan backwards, right? Have a very clear objective for your career growth and then plan and execute accordingly.